3 dump trucks, and one arrogant decision were all it took to freeze a $40 million development project dead in its tracks. The crazy part is, none of that was supposed to happen. I wasn't some activist. I wasn't looking for a fight. Honestly, if you'd asked anyone in my neighborhood what kind of person I was, they would have probably described me as the guy who waves from the driveway, mows his lawn every Saturday, and keeps mostly to himself. But sometimes people mistake being peaceful for being weak, and that's exactly what happened here. I live just outside a town called Silver Creek, Washington. Not a tiny town, not a big city either. One of those places where people still hold doors open for strangers, and where the biggest local news story is usually somebody's escaped goat wandering onto the high school football field. It was the kind of place I moved to after my divorce because I wanted quiet. Not excitement, not drama, just quiet. My house sat at the edge of a neighborhood that backed up to a large open field. For years, that field was nothing more than grass, blackberry bushes, and a few crooked pine trees that looked like they'd survived several bad decisions. Kids cut through it on their bikes. Dog walkers wandered across it. During summer evenings, I'd sit on my back deck with a beer and watch the sunset spill across all that empty space. It wasn't my land, but after staring at it every morning for almost 8 years, it felt like part of my life. Then, one Monday morning, I walked outside and saw a sign, a huge sign. Bright blue, professional, the kind of sign that immediately tells you somebody with a lot more money than you just bought something nearby. Coming soon, Pine Hollow Estates, luxury townhomes. I remember standing there with my coffee, staring at that sign while the steam drifted up into the cold morning air, and I had that weird feeling people get when they know something is ending before it's actually gone. Within a month, the field transformed. First came the survey crews, then the excavators, then the bulldozers, then the endless backup alarms. Beep, 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 every morning at 6:45 like clockwork. Now look, I understood development happens. People need houses. Towns grow. I wasn't one of those neighbors who complains because somebody builds something near them. At least that's what I kept telling myself. Still, the noise wore on you. The dust wore on you. The constant movement wore on you. One afternoon, I was trimming weeds along my fence when I noticed a small mound of dirt sitting near the back corner of my property. Nothing major, maybe enough to fill a pickup truck. I looked at it for a second and shrugged. Construction sites are messy. Stuff happens. The next day, the pile looked bigger. The day after that, it was bigger again. That's when I started paying attention. A few evenings later, I sat on my deck and watched a dump truck back toward the fence line. The driver raised the bed. Dirt poured out, tons of it, right into that same corner. I remember setting my beer down and staring, because suddenly that little pile didn't seem accidental anymore. The next morning, before work, I walked out there and took a closer look. The mound was enormous now, at least 6 feet tall, maybe more, and it wasn't sitting near the property line. It was sitting across it, inside my yard. Now maybe you're wondering why I didn't immediately storm over there. Truth is, I hate confrontation, always have. My ex-wife used to joke that if somebody stole my parking spot, I'd apologize to them for needing it. So instead of getting angry, I convinced myself there had to be some explanation. Maybe they got confused. Maybe somebody misread a map. Maybe they'd fix it once they noticed. That afternoon, I walked over to the construction office trailer. Inside was a man named Kyle Mercer. I didn't know his name yet, but I would. Trust me, I would learn it very well. Kyle looked exactly like the kind of guy who never hears the word no. Expensive boots, crisp safety vest, clean hard hat without a scratch on it. He wasn't digging holes. He was the guy telling everybody else where to dig them. I introduced myself, told him I live next door. Then I mentioned the dirt pile. Kyle glanced up from his paperwork. What about it? It's on my property. He leaned back in his chair and looked out the trailer window. Pretty sure the property line's somewhere around there. Around there. That phrase hit me wrong immediately. Not because of what he said, because of how he said it. Like details didn't matter, like boundaries were suggestions. I kept my voice calm. I've got a survey, it's definitely on my side. Kyle smiled. Not a friendly smile. The kind of smile people give when they're already dismissing you before you finish talking. It's temporary. That was it. 2 words. Temporary. We'll move it later. We're moving a lot of material right now. No apology, no concern, no discussion. Just temporary. I nodded, thanked him for his time. Then I walked home. But something about that conversation sat wrong with me all night. Maybe it was his tone. Maybe it was the smile. Maybe it was the feeling that he'd already decided I wasn't worth taking seriously. After dinner, I dug through an old filing cabinet in the garage and found my property survey. I spread it across the kitchen table, measured everything twice, then measured it again. The results weren't even close. The dirt pile wasn't accidentally crossing the line. It wasn't barely crossing the line. It was sitting several feet onto my property, clear as day. And that was the moment something shifted inside me. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter, something colder. The realization that this wasn't a mistake. They knew exactly what they were doing. The next morning before sunrise, I drove to a hardware store and bought a pack of bright orange survey flags. I walked the property line exactly as marked on the survey and planted those flags straight through the middle of the dirt pile, one after another, like tiny orange warning signs, impossible to miss. Then I stood there looking at them, the cold morning air biting at my face, coffee steaming in my hand, waiting to see what would happen next. For a few minutes, I actually believed common sense would win. I thought maybe the truck drivers would see the markers. Maybe somebody would realize there'd been a mistake. Maybe we'd all act like adults. At 7:02 a.m., the first dump truck rolled in. And what happened next told me everything I needed to know about the people I was dealing with. At 7:02 a.m., the first dump truck rolled in. I was standing at my kitchen window holding a coffee mug, watching through the glass. The driver backed up toward the pile, stopped for a second, just long enough to notice the flags. I could actually see him lean out the window, look directly at them. Then he dumped the load anyway. Dirt poured down the side of the mound, burying half the markers I'd planted less than an hour earlier. I remember laughing. Not because it was funny, because it was so unbelievably disrespectful that my brain didn't know what else to do. That was the moment everything changed. Before that, I thought there was a misunderstanding. After that, I knew there wasn't. The flags had answered the question for me. They knew exactly where the property line was. They just didn't care. So I stopped trying to be the reasonable neighbor. Instead, I started documenting everything. Every truck, every load, every day. I took pictures before work, pictures after work, pictures from my deck, pictures from the fence, pictures showing the flags, pictures showing the survey stakes, pictures showing how the pile kept spreading farther into my yard. The crazy thing about paying attention is that once you start, you notice details you'd normally miss. I noticed the drivers never hesitated anymore. I noticed Kyle stop making eye contact whenever he saw me. I noticed workers occasionally glance toward my yard and then quickly look away, like they knew something wasn't right. One evening, my neighbor, Martha Reynolds, caught me taking photos. Martha was retired, late 60s, lived across the street, the unofficial mayor of the neighborhood. If a squirrel sneezed 3 blocks away, Martha somehow knew about it before sunset. She walked over carrying a watering can. "What are we investigating today?" she asked. I pointed toward the dirt pile. "They're dumping on my property." Her smile disappeared immediately. She walked over to the fence, looked, then looked again. "Honey, that's definitely your side. That's what I keep telling them. You talk to somebody? Site supervisor?" I laughed. He called it temporary. Martha snorted. Not laughed, snorted. The way people do when they hear something ridiculous. Temporary is contractor language for "we'll stop when somebody forces us to." That sentence followed me home, because deep down I knew she was right. For days I'd been hoping they'd do the right thing. But people who intend to do the right thing usually don't ignore survey markers. A few nights later I couldn't sleep. I sat on my deck listening to the distant hum of machinery parked on the construction site. The dirt pile looked almost black under the moonlight. Huge, ugly, completely out of place. And I found myself thinking about something my father used to say. When somebody takes a step over your line and you let them, they don't stop there. They take another step, then another. Then eventually they forget there was ever a line at all. The next morning I took a vacation day from work. Not because I wanted a day off. Because I wanted a day off. Because I wanted answers. I drove downtown to the county planning office. The building looked exactly like every government building you've ever seen. Fluorescent lights, grey carpet, people moving slowly while carrying folders. Nobody looked excited to be there, including me. I explained the situation to the woman behind the counter. Construction project next door. Dumping soil on private property. Property line dispute. She listened quietly, typed something into her computer, then disappeared into the back. A few minutes later, she returned carrying a thick project file. "You can review the public permits here." I thanked her and sat down at one of the tables. At first, none of it made sense. Engineering reports, drainage plans, environmental assessments, maps covered in symbols that looked like alien hieroglyphics. Then I found something called a soil handling and storage plan. And suddenly things got interesting. Very interesting. I started reading carefully. Then I read it again, then a third time. The first thing that jumped out at me was simple. Excess excavation soil had to be transported to approved disposal locations, not neighboring yards, not nearby vacant lots, approved disposal sites. Then I found another section. Temporary storage areas had to remain entirely within project boundaries. Entirely. Not mostly. Not approximately. Entirely. I felt my heartbeat speed up. Because this wasn't a gray area anymore. This wasn't a disagreement between neighbors. This was a permit violation. Then I found something even worse. Erosion control requirements, retaining barriers, runoff protection, containment systems. The pile in my yard had none of it. Absolutely none. And less than 40 feet away sat a storm drain connected directly to the city's drainage network. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the paperwork, thinking about Kyle's smile, thinking about temporary, thinking about how casually he brushed me aside. Because now I understood something important. The dirt itself wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that somebody had decided rules only mattered when they were convenient. I walked back to the counter. "What happens if a contractor violates these permit conditions?" The woman looked up. "You can file a complaint." "Then what?" "An inspector gets assigned." "How long?" She shrugged. "Depends." Not exactly dramatic. No sirens, no emergency response, just paperwork. But sometimes paperwork is the most dangerous thing in the world, especially when somebody has been ignoring it. I filed the complaint. Every photo, every date, every note, the property survey, the permit references, everything. When I finally walked out of that building, I felt strangely calm. For the first time since this started, I wasn't arguing, I wasn't negotiating, I wasn't asking. I had simply handed the situation over to people whose job was enforcing rules. And now all I could do was wait. 3 days passed, then 4. The pile kept growing. By that point, the grass underneath was gone. Completely dead, crushed flat under tons of soil. The construction crews seemed busier than ever, almost like they were racing against an invisible clock. Then came Friday morning. The morning everything changed. I was sitting on my deck when 2 white county trucks turned into the construction entrance. Official logos on the doors, government plates. Curtboards visible through the windshield. The second they arrived, the atmosphere on site shifted. You could feel it. Workers slowed down. Conversations stopped. A foreman suddenly appeared from somewhere. People started pointing. Machines idled. Nobody looked relaxed anymore. I watched one of the inspectors walk directly toward the property line, toward the dirt pile, toward my yard. And for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, I saw something I hadn't seen from the construction crew since this whole mess started. Nervousness. Real nervousness. One inspector stopped near the buried survey flags. The other opened a folder. They exchanged a few words, measured something, then measured it again, and as I started walking toward them, I noticed Kyle emerging from the site office trailer. No smile this time, no confidence, no casual attitude. Just a man moving very quickly toward a conversation he clearly didn't want to have. And standing there between the inspectors and the massive dirt pile, I suddenly realized something. This wasn't my fight anymore. Now it was theirs, and judging by the look on Kyle's face, he knew it too. And standing there between the inspectors and the massive dirt pile, I suddenly realized something. This wasn't my fight anymore. Now it was theirs. And judging by the look on Kyle's face, he knew it too. I walked over and introduced myself. The inspectors already had copies of the complaint, but they wanted to hear the story directly from me. So I showed them everything. The survey, the photographs, the dates, the buried flags, the daily growth of the pile. They listened carefully without interrupting. No opinions, no emotions, just facts. One of them, a tall guy named Peterson, spent almost 10 minutes measuring distances from the fence line. The other inspector walked around the perimeter making notes. Meanwhile, Kyle stood nearby pretending to be calm, But you know how sometimes somebody's body language tells the truth before their mouth does? His shoulders were tight. His jaw was clenched. Every few seconds he glanced toward the pile like maybe it would somehow shrink if he stared at it hard enough. Peterson finally stood up, brushed dirt off his gloves, looked toward the construction site, then looked at Kyle. Approximately 48% of this material is beyond project boundaries. The silence that followed was beautiful, not loud, not dramatic, just heavy. The kind of silence where everybody understands exactly what was just said. Kyle cleared his throat. Well, we've been moving material around temporarily. There was that word again. Temporary. Only this time it sounded a lot less convincing. Peterson didn't seem impressed. Temporary storage still has to comply with permit conditions. Kyle opened his mouth, closed it again. The inspector continued. No erosion controls. Another note on the clipboard. No containment barriers. Another note. Unauthorized off-site storage. Another note. Each sentence felt like another brick being added to a wall that was slowly closing around him. For the next 20 minutes, the inspectors walked the site, measured elevations, reviewed permits, took photographs, talked quietly among themselves. Nobody from the construction crew was working anymore. Machines sat idle. Workers leaned against equipment pretending not to watch. But everyone was watching. Then came the moment that changed everything. Peterson approached Kyle, holding a form, said something quietly. Kyle's face immediately drained of color. The inspector handed him a copy. Kyle looked down, read it, then looked back up, and even from 30 feet away I knew exactly what had happened. The excavation phase had been suspended. Immediate stop work order. No more digging, no more hauling, no more moving soil. The entire operation froze, just like that. A project worth tens of millions of dollars brought to a standstill because somebody thought a neighbor's property line wasn't worth respecting. I wish I could tell you I felt triumphant. Truth is, what I felt was relief. For weeks I'd been questioning myself, wondering if I was overreacting, wondering if maybe I should have let it go, wondering if maybe I was becoming one of those difficult neighbors everybody complains about. Standing there watching that stop work order get issued, all those doubts disappeared. Not because I won, because I finally knew I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't being unreasonable. I was right. That evening, around sunset, there was a knock on my front door. I already knew who it was. Kyle. Only this version of Kyle looked very different from the one sitting comfortably inside the trailer 2 weeks earlier. No confidence, no smile, no dismissive attitude. Just a man carrying a problem. A very expensive problem. "Can we talk?" he asked. I stepped outside, closed the door behind me. "Sure." For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The construction site behind him sat completely silent. No engines, no machinery. Nothing. Finally, he sighed. "Look, things got out of hand. That almost made me laugh. Out of hand. That almost made me laugh. Out of hand. Like the dirt had magically walked onto my property by itself. We'd like to resolve this." I nodded. "I'm listening. We'll remove the soil." That was his opening offer. Just remove it. Like the last several weeks had never happened. Like my yard hadn't been buried under thousands of pounds of dirt. Like the grass hadn't died. Like the ground hadn't been compacted. I looked past him toward the pile, then back at him. "That's not enough." His eyebrows lifted. "What do you mean?" "I mean the damage doesn't disappear when the dirt disappears." The silence returned. He knew where this conversation was going. He just didn't like it. I pointed toward the yard. "That ground is ruined." He looked. Didn't argue, because he couldn't. The evidence was literally sitting behind him. You remove every bit of soil. I started counting on my fingers. You regrade the area. Another finger. You bring in fresh topsoil. Another finger. You restore the lawn. Another finger. And you do it properly. Carl rubbed the back of his neck. "That's a lot." I couldn't help smiling. "So is a stop work order." That landed exactly the way I intended it to. His eyes shifted toward the silent construction site, toward the idle equipment, toward the crews who weren't working, toward the money being lost every hour. For the first time since we'd met, the balance of power had completely flipped. 2 weeks earlier, he had all the leverage. Now I did. Finally, he nodded. "I'll talk to the developer." "Take your time." I glanced toward the empty excavation area. "It's not like anybody's digging tomorrow." He stared at me for a second. Then something unexpected happened. The arrogance disappeared, not all at once, but enough. For the first time, he looked less like a supervisor and more like a regular guy dealing with consequences. 3 days later, the trucks returned. Only now they were hauling dirt away instead of dumping it. And let me tell you something. Watching those trucks remove load after load from my yard was one of the most satisfying things I've ever seen. Every scoop felt like the property slowly taking a deep breath again. The giant mound shrank, then shrank some more, then finally disappeared. Underneath it was exactly what I expected. Dead grass, compacted soil, a hard, lifeless surface where healthy lawn used to be. The restoration crew arrived the next day. Fresh topsoil, grading equipment, landscapers, seed, water trucks. The whole operation. This time they weren't cutting corners, because now everyone was paying attention, including me. I didn't hover, I didn't interfere. I simply watched, quietly. The same way I'd watched them bury it. A week later, the inspectors returned for a final review. Peterson walked the entire property line, compared photographs, reviewed documentation, checked restoration work. Then he gave a small nod, marked something on his clipboard, and that was it. The stop work order was lifted. Construction resumed. Machines restarted. Workers returned. The project moved forward again. Life slowly returned to normal. A month later, fresh grass covered the repaired section of my yard. You couldn't even tell what had happened, at least not at first glance. But there was one thing that remained. Along the edge of their property sat a newly installed retaining barrier. Nothing fancy, just a functional wall designed to make sure dirt never crossed that boundary again. Every morning I'd sit on my deck with a cup of coffee and see it there. A permanent reminder. Not of the dirt, not of the fight, but of something bigger. Because the truth is, this story was never really about soil. It was about boundaries, the physical kind and the personal kind. Sometimes people push those boundaries because they need help, sometimes because they make mistakes, and sometimes because they genuinely believe nobody will stop them. The developer didn't lose weeks of work because of dirt. They lost weeks of work because they assumed the rules applied differently to them than everyone else. And honestly, that's the part I still think about. If Kyle had simply apologized during that first conversation, if somebody had moved the pile when I planted those flags, if they'd shown even a little respect, none of this would have happened. Instead, they kept pushing, and eventually they pushed themselves right into a stop work order. Now here's the question I still go back and forth on. Did I go too far? Some people say I should have accepted the apology and moved on. Others think I should have sued them for even more. Personally, I think I asked for exactly what was fair. Nothing more, nothing less. But I'm curious what you think. If a company started using your property like it belonged to them, would you have fought back the same way? Would you have pushed for full restoration, or would you have let it go to keep the peace? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because stories like this always split people right down the middle. And honestly, that's what makes them interesting. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes boundaries matter. Because sometimes the smallest line on a property survey ends up teaching the biggest lesson of all.